Hi, and welcome back to our series Interesting History. This episode is a sequel to our last video on the Great Trek, so if you haven't seen that one yet, just click right here. So today we'll be talking about the two most important internationally recognized Boer Republics, all the way from their creation to their political systems, their age of prosperity, and finally their dissolution in 1902, with the end of the Second Boer War. As we mentioned in the last episode, the Great Trek had helped give the Boers their own cultural identity in form of Afrikanerism, which motivated the Boers to create their own states. The first of these states to gain independence was that of Transvaal, officially named the Suid-Afrikaanse Republiek. I'm absolutely horrible at Dutch. Due to its isolated location, Britain had literally no authority over the region, and as such agreed to give its inhabitants independence with the signing of a treaty named the Sand River Convention. Later on, in 1854, the Orange Free State, another Boer country, also won sovereignty with the Orange River Convention. Ironically though, 2 years before, all Europeans in the area across the Orange River had been given the opportunity to vote on independence, and since the Orange Free State had such a large British population in the south due to its close proximity to the British Cape Colony, the majority in the region actually voted to remain a part of the British Empire. However, the British Council in the region up to this point had been so completely ineffective, the British Cape government saw no other alternative to that of simply giving the area independence and leaving the denizens of the Orange Free State to fend for themselves. So now both of these newly born Boer nations were confronted with the task of constructing an efficient governmental and legal system in just a relatively short period of time. The problem there, though, was that since the Boers were basically just a bunch of farmers, because that's what Boer means, they had no experience in these highly bureaucratic fields, and many had read no other book than the Bible. A book that, if I might add, is an amazing read. Very compelling plot, great story. I'll give it 9 out of 10 ox-pulled wagons. Anyways, so both Transvaal and the Orange Free State opted for a Parliamentary Republic, modeled after the American system, which in the time of oppressive kings and queens was actually quite forward-thinking. There was to be a legislative body named the Volksraad, which consisted of elected representatives, an executive body, headed by a president who was elected every 5 years, together with a commander-general who had authority over a very small military, as well as a judiciary system of courts from a regional all the way up to a national level. Every law and every court decision needed to be in accordance to the Bible, thus making Christianity, and in particular Protestantism, state religion. In addition to this, each state had its own constitution which guaranteed its citizens' rights and stated the government's powers, and included principles such as freedom of speech and equal treatment under the law, but not a separation of church and state. But the crux of all this was who was even allowed to be a citizen. In Transvaal, for example, and keep in mind this is in the middle of southern Africa, you had to be a white male, 16 years and older, and a member of the Transvaal Dutch Reformed Church. However, later on I will admit, Transvaal did allow white males of other Dutch Reformed churches to be citizens as well. In that respect, the constitution of the Orange Free State was a lot more liberal. There, even blacks, who had undergone the process of so-called Europeanization, had at least a chance at voting, and due to its larger British population, adherents to Protestant denominations other than that of the South African Reformed Church had a chance of becoming citizens as well. Generally speaking, though, if you were part of the small privileged group that did have the right to vote, the Boer states were undoubtedly perfect. The Orange Free State was even considered a model state at its time. But if you're one of those people that didn't have guaranteed rights, and especially if you were black, you could be abused and in many cases forced into conditions a little different to those of slavery, a thing which the British had forced the Boer nations to indefinitely ban when giving them independence in the early 1850s. Now you can't talk about the Boer republics and Afrikaner culture as a whole without mentioning their religious zealousness. Since the Boer settlers were of primarily Dutch origins, most were Reformed Protestants. Religion played a pivotal role in Boer society and culture. The early trekkers had developed the belief that they were God's chosen people during the Great Trek, and similar to the Israelites fleeing Egypt in the Old Testament, they were on the search for the land of milk and honey in the vastness of South Africa. This also gave the Boers a warrant to mistreat the native African tribes who were settling on the land that God had supposedly deemed to be theirs. Now, despite having finally gained sovereignty, and even having introduced a functional governmental system, the Boers still found themselves in a very much hostile environment towards them. To the north, west, and east were the native African tribes, most notably the Basotho, who held the Boers in serious contempt after experiencing decades after decades of exploitation and displacement by them, and were now increasingly willing to fight to defend their lands. To the south was the encroaching British Empire, which in recent years had shown a growing imperialist and expansionist attitude. So at this point one might ask oneself why the Boers of Transvaal and the Orange Free State didn't simply unite into one larger, stronger, and undivided Boer state. Well, interestingly, the Transvaal did actually try to do this under their first president, Martinus Pretorius, coincidentally also the founder of Transvaal's and modern-day South Africa's capital, Pretoria. This peaceful attempt of uniting the two states, however, failed, since the Orange Free State government initially declined the offer. Seeing this, President Pretorius prepared to forcefully invade, but in the last moment, a strong national backlash, as well as a surprisingly fast mobilized Orange Free State army, convinced the president to act otherwise. Later on, though, in 1859, after a change of governments in the Orange Free State, this time both countries sought to merge. But Britain, fearing a strong united Boer state, quickly intervened, stating that such an act would violate the terms of both the Orange and Sand River Convention, and Britain would therefore no longer feel bound to respect Boer sovereignty. And so the Boers were coerced into backing off. However, the two countries did find a way to, well, sort of unite, and that was by giving the incumbent president of Transvaal, Pretorius, the presidency of the Orange Free State as well, without officially converging the two nations. This at first seemingly good thing quickly ended in dissatisfaction among politicians of the Transvaal Parliament. Long story short, one of those politicians took a hands-on approach to the matter, and the whole situation ended up in a small civil war. This civil war itself was actually quite unspectacular, and the rebellion was quickly put down by the Pretorius and his later in life notorious assistant Paul Kruger. Yet this quick mobilization had cost the Transvaal government a massive amount of money, and severely weakened the already struggling economy and plunged the country into debt. You see, both countries couldn't really levy any large taxes on their populations, since high taxes had been one of the incentives which had motivated the Boers in the first place to leave the British Cape Colony during the Great Trek. Additionally, both the Orange Free State and Transvaal were landlocked countries, and as such had a hard time importing as well as exporting the little goods they had available. During the 1860s, the Boer nations actually made most of their money exporting ivory and other exotic goods. Yet this still didn't prove enough to keep their economies afloat. Unlike Transvaal, the Orange Free State enjoyed a growing age of prosperity during the 1860s, since it had been free of inner turmoil. And then, in the early 1870s, something happens which at first changes the political, economic, and actual landscape of the Orange Free State, and later on of all of South Africa forever. Diamonds are discovered. At first, this expensive rare commodity is only found in the Orange Free State, and subsequently leads the way to an enormous economic boom. Large multinational corporations are attracted to the small Boer country, along with thousands of British workers who work in the mines. Of the Boers, though, only few start working in the mines. Most continue to be farmers. Transvaal's economy, however, remains crippled during these years, since only minor deposits of valuable materials have been found there up to this point. And by 1877, Transvaal's economy was so close to bankruptcy that Britain saw its chance. British troops marched into the capital of Pretoria and established the British colony of Transvaal, the British justification being to stabilize the Transvaal economy and to save it from bankruptcy. The people and government of Transvaal, of course outraged by this, at first responded not with violence, but instead sent a delegation to London under Paul Kruger, as well as to the United States, in order to try to find a peaceful solution to this matter, which of course would see Transvaal re-established as an independent nation. The endeavor was doomed to fail, since Britain had no interest in giving back land which gave them a strategic advantage in South Africa, but also because Transvaal had shown signs of a growing diamond and gold industry, and so Britain had an incentive to help British companies that might be coming into the region. And so, in 1880, the First Boer War broke out between the rebelling Boers of the small nation of Transvaal and the mighty British Empire. The Boers, led by Paul Kruger, who had now returned from London, soon gained the upper hand over the small British colonial force due to their effective guerrilla tactics, but also expertise on the field, as well as an excellent knowledge of the fighting terrain. Thus the First Boer War ended in a disaster for the British Army, and for the first time since the American Revolution, Britain had to make peace with the former colony under terms not auspicious to them. Transvaal was once again guaranteed independence by Britain, and soon after, Paul Kruger was elected president. Fun fact: the First Boer War was also one of the last times the traditional red British fighting uniform, known to many as the red coat, was used in battle. Since the red color was so easy to be seen in the South African landscape, British soldiers were in many cases easy targets for the Boers. After seeing this, Britain started introducing more appropriate camouflage uniforms like the British khaki. By the way, during the whole First Boer War, the Orange Free State remained officially completely neutral, since it had no intent in damaging its at the time good relations with Britain. However, many Boer individuals volunteered to help their Transvaal counterparts. Now, even though Transvaal had been stripped of its sovereignty for 4 whole years, from 1877 to 1881, many historians actually argue that this might have been for its own good, since the British really did save the nation from an economic disaster and bankruptcy. So throughout the mid and late 1880s, both Boer nations flourished. However, now it was Transvaal's turn to experience a massive economic boom. By 1886, immense amounts of gold had been discovered near Transvaal's capital city of Pretoria, which, just like in the Orange Free State 15 years earlier, saw large companies hastily coming into the region in order to secure their place in the mining industries, and along with them came the foreign workers. These immigrants came from all over Europe and were mostly poor and unskilled and searching for success in the gold mines of South Africa. These events really marked the start of a massive political and social problem for, in a sense, both Boer states, but primarily Transvaal because they had a bigger gold industry. Even though these new immigrants brought wealth and stability to the nation, they also developed a will to become active members of Transvaal's society and political scene. And soon, the government feared that these foreigners, or Uitlanders as they called them, would leave the Boers to be a minority in their own country. This, of course, excluding the blacks. They, by some estimates, already outnumbered the Boers tenfold. So the Volksraad introduced laws restricting the rights of foreign companies and individuals. Now, in order to become a citizen, you had to have been in the country for 14 years instead of just 5, and undergone a process of naturalization. Many of these foreigners were forced to move into slums near the mines and in ghettos of the growing cities of Johannesburg and Pretoria. In fact, Johannesburg at this point actually even held the title of the fastest growing city in the world. By the way, blacks at this point had been forced to either live in reservations or in slums, but they still had absolutely no chance of becoming citizens in Transvaal. So all of this severely angered the British Empire. They had hoped that these large numbers of immigrants would bring a change to the relatively conservative anti-British Boer republics. Additionally, this was at the height of the scramble for Africa between competing European imperialist powers, and the two independent nations of Transvaal and the Orange Free State very much irritated British expansionists, since they, for one, restricted British expansion to the north, undermined British hegemony in southern Africa, and had access to valuable minerals that the British desired. One of these British expansionists was a man by the name of Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes was a South African business tycoon of modest origins who himself had invested quite an amount of wealth in the growing gold and diamond industries of the Boer Republics, and was therefore angered by the high tariffs the Boer governments had imposed on his companies. But probably even more significantly, Cecil Rhodes had the dream of a railway from Cairo to Cape Town, all on British soil, and envisioned a world where Britain was the ultimate superpower. In order to fulfill this, he had received the blessing of the British Cape Governor to transform the vast amount of unclaimed land of modern-day Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Zambia into his company territory in the name of the United Kingdom. This was a smart political move since this isolated both Boer republics, while at the same time increasing British influence in southern Africa. Both Transvaal and the Orange Free State were worried and felt threatened by the sudden British expansion, and so in 1889 the two very similar nations agreed to a military pact, stating that each nation would aid the other in the case of war. The two countries knew that they needed to stick together, especially now that they had become so rich through the diamond and gold industries, and with the simultaneously growing British envy, an invasion could not be completely ruled out. At the same time, Transvaal's government also created closer diplomatic ties to the German Empire, which had established a colony in the nearby area of modern-day Namibia. The German Empire had within the last 20 years become one of Britain's strongest competitors and rivals in Europe, and now at the height of imperialism in Africa as well. This of course distressed the British Empire to a large extent. They felt as if their dominance as the leading imperialist power had been undermined. And this is where Cecil Rhodes comes in to save the day. He, along with a man named Leander Sir Jameson, devised a plan to launch a surprise cavalry attack from British Rhodesia straight into Transvaal's heartland and take their capital. They hoped that the Uitlander miners in Transvaal, who at this point outnumbered the Boers in their own country by about 2 to 1, would be happy to rebel against the Boers and their oppressive and exclusionist policies and thus aid the cavalry attack. But the British Cape Governor was reluctant to give his support to Rhodes and Jameson, for one, he feared that the miners in Transvaal wouldn't be as eager to rebel as originally thought, and he also feared that a failed attack would spur hostilities and possibly renew tensions between the Boer republics and Britain. This could potentially also tarnish Britain's international reputation, as countries such as Germany and Austria-Hungary could easily use this as a paradigm of Britain's insatiable power-hungriness. Long story short, the attack failed, since the miners were unwilling to mobilize against the Boers. The 1895 attack became known as the Jameson Raid, and as the British Cape Governor had expected, the international backlash was enormous. The German Kaiser even sent Paul Kruger, the president of Transvaal, a telegram congratulating him on his staunchness against the British. The Boer Republic of Transvaal was, as you can expect, enraged by this undeclared attack, and believed that this was Britain showing its true colors, and that it was only a matter of time before the next attack came. In response, first Transvaal started importing mass quantities of arms, and later the Orange Free State also joined in on the mass mobilization. It was at this point clear that the Boer Republics and the British Empire could not coexist. And sure enough, in September 1899, the United Kingdom set an ultimatum, stating that either the Transvaal government would concede to equal rights between Uitlanders and Boers, or there would be war. President Kruger realized that this would practically mean the end of the Boer country, so in an act of defiance he set an ultimatum of his own, announcing that if the British didn't demobilize their troops on the Transvaal border, this would be seen as an act of war, and therefore Transvaal, along with its military ally the Orange Free State, would proceed to attack the British Empire. The demand was met by laughter in the British Parliament. Nobody believed that the tiny Boer Republic stood a chance against the world's leading superpower. And so, the Second Boer War began. Now, without going into too much detail about the actual military history of the conflict, I will say that after many early successes, the Boers staged an attack into the British province of Natal, which eventually got bogged down and ultimately failed. The British, after experiencing a myriad of defeats, mobilized a powerful army from all over their empire, since the prospect of the rich diamond and gold preserves of the Boer states was enough to motivate the British Parliament to dedicate quite a bit of money to the cause. This resulted in the capturing of both Boer capitals by June 1900. But many Boers refused to lay down their arms and continued to fight a guerrilla war in the region for 2 more years, which ended in many additional British casualties. As a reward for those of you who've watched until now, we have a second fun fact, which actually isn't that much fun at all. It's really quite unsettling. The intense guerrilla resistance by the Boers led the British to construct concentration camps, long before Germany's infamous use during the Second World War. The British were so frustrated they thought that the concentration camps would help demoralize the fighting Boer men if they saw their families being held in such appalling conditions, really. The result were 30,000 dead Boers, primarily women and children. But the strategy must have worked, to some extent at least, because on May 31st, 1902, both Boer republics surrendered. The terms of the surrender were written down in the subsequent Treaty of Vereinigung. Interestingly enough, though, this treaty did little to change the Boer way of life, and it could to some even be seen as a victory for the Boers. The British granted the Boers autonomy within the British Empire, all lands were reinstated, and the British even obliged to pay a large sum of reparation costs for all property that had been damaged in the war. In conclusion, you can say that the story of the Boer Republics had large effects on South Africa's economic scene, and caused many problems of which we can still witness quite a few today. Since all Boer farmers were able to keep control of their large swaths of land after the war, the large native population of Africans never had a chance in South Africa's strong agricultural sector. Nowadays, South Africa still faces disproportionate land and thus wealth distribution between the descendants of the white Boer farmers and blacks. Additionally, the Treaty of Vereinigung had also granted the Boers autonomy. This allowed the Boers, who were later called Afrikaners, to gain large influence in the Union of South Africa, which was created to unite all South African provinces in 1910. Thus, the Boer principles of what we would today call white supremacy could be eventually instituted in the whole of South Africa, and so Apartheid was born. But the Boer republics, and especially the Second Boer War, also had effects on global diplomatic relations. Britain was heavily reviled for its treatment of the Boer population in the war, and especially for fighting 2 peaceful white democracies who were, if you remember from the beginning of this episode, were considered by some to be model states. In countries like Germany and the Netherlands, and even some of Britain's allied nations such as France and the US, this encouraged anti-British sentiment and increased Britain's unpopularity. Thus, the already growing polarization between imperialist nations in Europe was increased even further, and the likelihood of a war of never-before-seen dimensions grew and eventually became reality in the horrors of World War I. Thank you for watching Interestivity, and we would be happy if you join us next time as we explore the events of the Trail of Tears. If you want a video about a certain topic that interests you, or even if you need any clarity about any of our past videos, please leave a comment or contact us at interestivity@gmail.com. We hope you're a little bit smarter now, and see you soon.